Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we look at today's news and events and trends from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this evening we're joined by John Fund, author of the new book, Who's Counting? John,
Thanks.
welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for coming, and tell us a little bit about what prompted you to write the third book that you've written about voter fraud and integrity.
And bureaucratic bungling in our election system. We have the sloppiest election systems of any industrialized democracy. That's not my opinion. It's the opinion of America's leading political scientist, Walter Dean Burnham. Other countries put us to shame. Mexico, for example, has a very sophisticated election system. Everyone has a national ID card for voting. There's a hologram on it. There's a computerized database that's national. You dip your finger in ink to show you can't vote twice. System works very well. Canada has a nationwide voter ID law, something that half our states don't have. We have very poorly designed and maintained voter registration lists. The Pew Research Center, which is an impeccably nonpartisan group, found we have almost 2 million Americans who are dead, who are on the voter rolls. Now, I believe we should honor our dead, but I do not believe they should have representation without respiration.
Well, this obviously you're a racist because you're looking for voter ID and you're looking for
signs of life.
Signs of life. I mean, yeah, discrimination against the dead. What originally prompted you to even start investigating voter fraud?
Well, I grew up in Northern California. In fact, not far from here in Contra Costa County and later Sacramento. During college, I had a political science term paper I had to write, and I decided I was going to write it on a very close state legislative race in San Joaquin County where they were having a recount. So I drove down to the county seat, and I think I sat through every hour of the recount. And I saw with my own eyes people stealing votes. Back then you had optical scan machines. These were machines like you have in high school or college where you fill in the bubble to make your choice. And the clever way that they were stealing the votes were some of the election officials had pieces of pencil underneath their fingernail. And what they would do is when they got to the point on the optical scan ballot where that race that was being contested was featured, they would take their finger and rub it over one of the other bubbles, creating an overvote. In other words, somebody had voted twice for that office, or at least that's what the computer scan would show. Well, if you do that with the candidate you don't want to win, guess what? Your candidate will gain votes, the other candidate will lose votes proportionately. So a race that was decided, I think, 90 votes in favor of one candidate ended up being decided by something like 50 or 60 votes for the other candidate. And I sat on the floor of the California State Assembly, and I watched the member who had been sworn in and had been collecting a paycheck for several weeks removed from the chamber because of that recount, and someone else installed who I knew had been elected illegally.
So this was pre-hanging Chad. There were still ways to, shall we say, cheat?
There's still ways to cheat today.
Yes.
Now, luckily, we have made some progress. The hanging Chad is pretty much in a museum now.
Right.
The old voter machines that you see in New York, with the curtain and all of that, those used to be very easily manipulated because people would, shall we say, open the back of them when they were in storage and run up the score. So when the machine was actually delivered to the polling place, there were already several hundred votes for, shall we say, the correct candidate already on the machine.
Interesting. So, in your opinion, is the electronic voting capability something that's better or worse for protecting the integrity of the vote?
Potentially better, because if it's the right technology and we spend enough money on it to make sure that it's well maintained and the software is open source, or at least someone can look at it, and we also have a paper trail. People are going to demand a paper trail.
Sure.
Electronic voting machines help. You can blow up the print if you're nearsighted. You can feature many, many languages, and of course that's required by federal law. You can also vote on it if you're blind. You don't need assistance because it can speak back to you.
Right.
So in theory, electronic voting machines are better. However, the reason why we trust ATM machines at the bank a lot more than electronic voting machines is in part the ATM machines cost about 10 times more. Most people don't keep the receipt if they make a deposit or make a short cash withdrawal. They trust those machines, most of them. Electronic voting machines, we do it on the cheap, and therefore we don't trust them as much. I think if they're going to be accepted more by the public, I think we're probably going to have to upgrade. I don't think there are Manchurian computer programmers behind the scenes manipulating the election.
There have been a lot of rumors and conspiracies about that.
But one of the problems with that is the machines can't talk to each other. Unlike in Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez has all the computers send signals to a central counting place, and that's where the counting is done. That's when you can really manipulate an election using electronic machines.
Okay. And so in all of the research that you've done and looking at all of the discrepancies and the stories that have come out, what do you think is the biggest risk for having an election stolen?
Well, the bureaucratic mess that we have in many places, and not all places are this bad, but where we have bureaucratic sloppiness and bureaucratic bungling, it creates an atmosphere in which you can manipulate the system. Washington State had a governor's race. The Seattle election office was so chaotic that during the recount of a governor's race that was separated by 129 votes in the end, they ended up finding new ballots, 18 different times. Now, I believe there can be bureaucratic incompetence. This looked to me like practiced incompetence. We need some more votes. Oh, we have some.
Yes.
So
ignore the wet ink.
Exactly. So I think the real danger here is a lack of confidence in the system, which erodes support for our republic and our democracy. 40% of the American people, roughly, didn't really accept that George W. Bush won the presidential election. They thought it was rigged. They thought something had gone on behind the scenes. That was very, very deleterious to our democracy. If it hadn't been for 9/11, which I think temporarily rallied people behind the president, I think Bush would have had a great deal of difficulty leading the country. Al Franken. People are very upset about Al Franken's election in the U.S. Senate in Minnesota in 2008. It was an 8-month legal battle over who won that seat. The seat was vacant the entire time.
Right.
Franken was finally declared the victor by 312 votes out of 4 million. And you know what? Al Franken's election had real consequences for everyone in your audience.
That's exactly right.
Because he provided the 60th vote to break the Republican filibuster against Obamacare.
Right.
We would not have Obamacare in its current form without Al Franken's vote. And that 60th vote, I think, was compromised because after he was sworn in, we learned something. We learned not only were a bunch of absentee ballots counted with different standards, often widely varying in the recounts, but we learned that 1,100 felons voted illegally in that election.
Yes.
Now, we can't be sure how they voted because it's a secret ballot, but when Fox News went and interviewed a bunch of them, 9 out of 10 said Al Franken. When felons register by party in the half states where you register by party, routinely 75% of felons register with a certain political party. So the best guess is that Franken's victory margin was more than compensated by felon voting that was illegal.
Right.
Now, this evidence was turned over to prosecutors. They couldn't prosecute anyone who simply said, I'm a felon, I forgot I couldn't vote, I didn't realize I lost my rights. They couldn't do that because you have to prove intent to break the law. They could only prosecute people who were stupid enough to say, yeah, I voted illegally, I knew it was wrong, what's it to you, copper?
Yeah.
So they
Jail me.
Well, you know what? They have gone after 200 of those felons and convicted them. There's 66 more in the pipeline, dozens more being investigated. It is possible, Chris, we could end up with more felons being convicted illegally of voting in that Al Franken election than the margin of victory. But I don't think it's going to be much of a deterrent in the future. Do you know what the average penalty for voting illegally in that close election that changed the country's history?
And nowhere near severe enough. What is
$50 bucks.
$50. Wow.
Now, $50 is nothing. That's how much you pay to buy someone's vote in many states.
That's exactly right. So, what's been the most egregious kind of a scenario you've seen? Just blatant fraud. I mean, we're seeing some prosecutions pop up here and there. Many of these things, as you say, go unprosecuted. No penalties issued.
What really upsets me is I can have an honest, sincere debate with opponents of laws like photo ID, cleaning up absentee ballots. That you can have different perspectives. Some people sincerely believe that the health of a democracy is represented by how many people vote.
Right.
So you have to have the most votes possible, and you shouldn't worry about if a few of them are illegitimate. Well, it's getting embarrassing for them to claim there's no voter fraud, which is what they constantly say. In September, this month, we had the Democratic congressional candidate in a Maryland district resign because it was discovered she had voted in 2 different states in 4 different elections illegally. This is shocking.
Right.
A congressional candidate? I mean, a few years ago, a former Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania committed voter fraud by going into Alzheimer's home patients and, shall we say, providing them with too much assistance in filling out their ballots. He pled guilty. In Kentucky, this is bipartisan, in Clay County recently, the Republican judge, basically the county executive, the superintendent of education, and a city councilman were all convicted of massive voter fraud. They had been bribed by a methamphetamine gang with $400,000 in cash to stuff the ballot boxes so that the sheriff and the other people in law enforcement of that county would leave the methamphetamine gang alone. This happens everywhere. Bill Clinton mounted the stage of the Democratic convention in Charlotte in September,
right,
and said, you know, these horrible laws are bringing us back to Jim Crow and poll taxes, trying to prevent voter fraud. 2 hours before Bill Clinton got up and spoke, back in his home state of Arkansas, a Democratic state legislator, a Democratic councilman from West Memphis, and a police official from West Memphis were all convicted of voter fraud in his home state.
Yeah.
And he says, of course, but there is no voter fraud.
Very, very scary stuff. And so you mentioned just as you were speaking there that it is a bipartisan issue. Although the Democrats tend to, at least in the circles I run in, have a much stronger reputation for assisting voters who may need that extra.
I think this is historical. It used to be, just like the 2 parties used to have completely different positions on trade than they do now.
Right.
It used to be the parties were flipped in terms of when it came to voter fraud. There was much more bipartisan voter fraud 50, 75, 100 years ago. Republican machines used to run Philadelphia, Chicago, Aldomado's Long Island, and New York. They stole votes. Those machines have collapsed. They've been replaced with either good government machines or Democratic machines like the Daily Machine in Chicago. So the most of the opportunity for voter fraud is in one party now. I'm not saying one party is automatically more honest than the other. I think political power is very seductive. People are going to be tempted to stray. But certainly one party, and Larry Sabato, the leading political scientist from the University of Virginia, agrees with me, one party now has far more of the opportunity to commit voter fraud and therefore far more of the temptation.
Right. And so talk to me about if you wbut king, which we don't allow here. But
I believe my job should be benevolent dictator.
I've heard that one's taken. but we'll
Hope springs eternal.
So talk to me about what you think really needs to happen in order to bring integrity back to the voting process and restore people's trust that their vote does really matter.
Well, let's look at California. It's very sad here because I think you have one of the worst election laws of any state in the country. It is not only that you don't have to show ID to vote. It's illegal to ask you to show ID.
Yes.
Now, ID is something that we all have to live with every day.
Right.
I mean, you can't go to the doctor's office without showing your ID. You can't travel. You
can't
cash
use
a
some
check.
restrooms without using your ID as a piece of collateral.
You have to have an ID for everything. If anyone doesn't have an ID, and I think it's very few people, you're basically cut out of the mainstream of American life. Andrew Young, the former confidant of Martin Luther King, former UN ambassador, told me, if there are people without an ID, we're doing them a favor by getting them one. Let's get them one.
Sure.
Let's have an outreach effort. If there's anyone who doesn't have an ID, all of these voter ID laws in all of these states say it should be free. Let's give them one. So what my complaint is with these liberal civil rights groups, self-anointed and self-appointed leadership of their communities, is, you know, are you about solving the problem? Or are you about making a political statement? Because if you want to solve the problem, you're spending tens of millions of dollars in publicity and lawyers fighting these laws on photo ID. If you spent a fraction of that in outreach to community members, making sure everyone had an ID, we could solve the problem and we wouldn't have to pay a bunch of lawyers.
Right.
So let's look at California. I think there will be a ballot initiative in California addressing this in 2014. It's already been drafted. It would do 3 things. Photo ID at the polls, Obviously, there would be provision for people who forgot their ID to cast a provisional ballot, and then they can fax, email, deliver, or otherwise get evidence of who they are, that they say they are, to an official in a week or 10 days after the election. Their vote will be counted. Absentee ballots. California has gone gaga over absentee ballots. I support absentee ballots, but I think we've gone too far. At the very least, though, if we don't curb the number of absentee ballots that people can cast without excuses, we should at least say, include the last 4 digits of your Social Security or driver's license for some ballot security. Some people would go further and say, let's have a thumbprint. Mm-hmm. Some people would go further and say, send in a Xerox of your ID. Voter registration rolls. They have to be cleaned up. The Pew Research Center, again, found 1 out of 8 registrations in this country on the voter rolls are invalid or have major mistakes. This is an engraved invitation to voter fraud. As you know, in California, you post the lists of voters in front of the polling place. Right. It's very easy at the end of the day to go and find out that someone hasn't voted. You can look up that they haven't voted in the last 4 elections. Right. You can be pretty sure they're not voting this election. You go in and vote for them. If they're dead and they're on the voter rolls, you're pretty sure you can vote any time of the day or night for them, and they're not going to complain.
It's true, and we hear the nightmare stories. We hear of...
Except they happen in daylight and they're real. Nightmares aren't real. This is real. It happens.
I've been told it doesn't exist.
So have I, which is why I find interesting all these fairy tales that show up in the newspapers talking about it, real-life examples of it happening.
Have you done any research on motor voter states and whether or not the improprieties show up more or less in those areas?
It's interesting. Our voter turnout really hasn't gone up after motor voter. It hasn't gone up after Oregon and Washington went to basically all-mail voting. Early voting hasn't gone up. All of these things that were supposed to make our democracy more vibrant don't seem to increase voter turnout. It's not my opinion. It's the opinion of Curtis Gans of the Center for the Study of the American Electorate. So why are we doing this? Well, it's making our election system less secure, less filled with integrity, and less trustworthy. I think we have to do something about it. I don't think it's an accident that this push for sloppy, fly by the seat of your pants laws has taken place. I think it's somewhat deliberate. Acorn, the massive voter registration fraud outfit that was finally busted and went bankrupt a few years ago, Acorn was notorious because they just didn't care about rules. They just went and did it. Yeah. Did you know what Barack Obama's first job in politics was?
Was that as a community organizer with Acorn, right?
Well, no, he had a job with other groups, but his first job in politics, as opposed to community organizing, was with a group called Project Vote in Chicago. They were the voter registration arm of Acorn. He did such a good job in that, he became their top trainer for Acorn in Chicago. He did such a good job with that. Guess who became Acorn's lawyer defending the motor voter law? Barack Obama. We have the president from Acorn sitting in the White House. Now, I'm sure that Barack Obama will have nothing to do with any irregularities that go on, but I'm sure he has many friends from his days who in a very close election will be tempted. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, and if you look at the fact that even though Acorn has gone bankrupt, it has remanifested itself.
It's now under new mismanagement.
Yeah, under new mismanagement.
Under new titles.
Exactly. Right. And so, additionally, you talk about friends that may support. There are rumors, of course, or there are people that with the distrust of, as an example, Attorney Holder, who is actually fighting against states who are trying to clean the debt off their rolls or who are trying to force voter ID rules.
Attorney General Holder loves to make speeches that voter ID is the return of Jim Crow and poll taxes. He gave a speech on that subject in Houston, Texas recently at the NAACP convention. Do you know what you had to show to go in and listen to that speech?
A photo ID.
Yes.
Just like getting into the Department of Justice.
Well, but you know what he said to a national news reporter? He said, no, you don't have to show an ID to come in and see me. Anyone can come in and see me. I mean, does he make this stuff up or does he actually believe it? I don't know which is worse. Here's the other thing. Someone, a 22-year-old punk, white guy, earring, beard, walked into Eric Holder's precinct in Washington, D.C. He'd lived there for 32 years. You'd think they'd know him. And said, do you have an Eric Holder on the books, your voter books, and such an address? And they said, sure, here's your ballot. Now, he didn't cast it because that would have been a crime. But if a 22-year-old guy who doesn't look anything like Eric Holder can get his ballot, I mean, how easy is it to impersonate someone? Even if it doesn't happen a lot, shouldn't we take a simple precautionary step and make it harder for that to happen?
Yeah. So what would be, we started to talk about it a little bit, but what would be the precautionary steps that you think would tighten it up sufficiently?
Well, I think the initiative in California that I mentioned, photo ID,
Right.
Ballot security for absentee ballots, cleaning up the voter registration rolls. I mean, we shouldn't have dead people, illegal aliens. By the way, in Orange County in the 1990s, there was a congressional race that I think may have been stolen. It was the Loretta Sanchez versus Bob Dornan race. A bunch of illegal aliens or non-citizens voted in that election. There was a House investigation. It didn't quite prove that enough people to make the margin of difference had voted, but there were 1,500 ballots that were under suspicion that may well have been cast illegally. The guy running this scheme, Nativo Lopez, ended up being convicted eventually of voter fraud himself many years later.
And so we have about a minute and a half left. What was the most interesting piece of information you found that you included in the new book?
Well, I think the most interesting is the extent to which this does not have to be a partisan issue. You know, Chris Dodd, the Democratic senator who helped write the Help America Vote Act, put it best. He said the goal of this election system should be to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. We can do both. Some people emphasize the easy to vote part, some people emphasize the hard to cheat part. But we can do both. We can keep it very easy for people to register to vote. Right now it just takes a postcard. And we can make sure those easy registrations get screened and people who shouldn't be voting don't vote. We can do both. This is America. We have done great things in opening up our democracy to new voices. We have two civil rights. One is to prevent people from being intimidated or blocked from voting. We fought a civil rights struggle over that. We need to preserve those gains. But there's a second civil right that everyone in your audience has. The right not to have your vote canceled out, to be disenfranchised by someone who shouldn't be voting, either because they're a felon, an illegal alien, someone who's dead, someone who doesn't even exist, or someone who's out of state or not in the proper jurisdiction.
Or
voting.
pets or other wildlife.
Well, by the way, we do learn from California voter registration rolls. God is a Republican and Jesus is a Democrat.
And how do we know this?
Because they registered.
Oh, there you have it. And
I don't know if they voted. You know, that commute is a long way.
It is a long one. But absentee is anything's possible.
It's true. I don't know about the celestial mail, but we'll see.
And where can people find out about the book?
Well, the book is available in the new normal places, including the normal websites that you would find good and interesting books.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, John. And at this point, we're going to stop for a quick word from our underwriters.
I'm a constitutional law attorney. And they say, oh really, what kind of constitutional law attorney? I say, well, I'm the true kind, the kind that believe that the Constitution is what the Constitution says and what it was intended to say. Anything beyond that is tyranny and should not be allowed.
So let's come to this, my friends. You ready for the second American Revolution against a ruling class that simply lectures but does not listen or defend the American people? It is government versus the people. Am I right? Yes. Look at the Electoral College example. Right? A leftist popular challenge to states' rights. You think the founders weren't brilliant people? Did they not know what they were doing? by carefully calibrating to get the small states and the big states to come together? Why does Wyoming get 2 senators in California? Actually, I'd rather have Wyoming's 2 senators.
Welcome back to The Right Side, and that was a word from our underwriter, the Conservative Forum. The Conservative Forum hosts speakers on a monthly basis here in Mountain View, California. You can find their meetings at the Portuguese IFES Hall at 432 Steerland Road in Mountain View. This evening's speaker will be one that will be very familiar to you if you've watched this show. It's John Fund. He'll be the speaker for September. In October, we have Jesse Lee Peterson coming to speak, and for the November presentation, not only is it going to be an election party and viewing night, John Caviani will be there, and he's a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. And we will also, in December, have a Christmas party featuring Armstrong and Getty. You can find out more about the Conservative Forum at theconservativeforum.com. In closing tonight, just wanted to remind you that voter integrity and truing the election process is extremely critical. As we've talked with John this evening, he only shared a portion of the stories that are available in his new book, Who's Counting. I've read a chunk of it, and I think it's definitely worth your time. When we look at the conflicts of integrity that happen in our own California system and the fact that we don't have a common voter registration base, that there have been videos of people coming in repeatedly into the same polling stations to cast and recast their votes. It's imperative that we as citizens stand up and fight for our right to protect our right to vote. So if you haven't gotten active already in doing that, John's book's a great place to start, as well as other programs like the Election Integrity Project or True the Vote based out of Texas. We appreciate you joining us this evening. Again, I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and we'll look forward to seeing you sometime soon. Thanks again.